Hello, everyone. I'm Catherine Bracy, CEO of TechEquity Collaborative. Thank you for joining us for this very important conversation. We are just waiting for the room to fill up. We will start in just a minute. Hello, everyone. I'm Catherine Bracy, CEO of TechEquity Collaborative. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on Black homeownership and the racial housing divide. We are just giving the room a couple of minutes to fill up, and we will start in just a minute. Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. Again, for those of you who just joined, I am Catherine Bracy. I'm TechEquity Collaborative's CEO. Thank you so much for joining us for this very important conversation about Black homeownership and the racial housing divide. Before we jump into the conversation with our wonderful panelists, I just want to give a quick introduction to TechEquity and what we do. We are an organization based in California that is mobilizing the tech community, so tech workers and tech companies, around a public policy agenda that we think will make it so that as the tech economy grows, more people benefit from that growth. And we do that in three ways. We educate people who work in tech on issues like this, through events like this and other kinds of content. We do advocacy work through our associated 501c4 organization, Tech Equity Action, to advance public policy in the California legislature and in some local governments in California that we think will make it so that as the tech economy grows, more people benefit from that growth. And we also work with tech companies to change corporate practice and in a way that will allow the wealth that tech companies are creating to accrue to more people. And we mainly focus in two issue areas: housing, obviously, this is a topic we're going to cover today, and also workforce and labor. I think it's important to say on the housing note, we really see this as a key issue. It may not be clear to everybody why housing would be an issue that is central to the work of an organization that's focused on the tech industry, but we really see fixing the housing crisis as one of the top critical ways that we can ensure that the wealth that's being created in this country, in large part through the tech industry, can accrue to more people. And that's a topic we're obviously going to talk about today. So that's why we think it's really important for folks who work in tech and for tech companies to think about how they can influence housing policy to make it possible for everybody to have an affordable roof over their head and for everybody to be able to live close enough to the economic centers so that they can benefit from the growth that the tech industry is creating. So before we get started, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. We have the chat open, which is a little bit of a leap of faith in this day and age. So feel free to have a back channel conversation there, but know that we do enforce a code of conduct at all of our events. So Herman, my colleague, will post a link to that so you can read it in more depth. But generally, it just says be respectful. respect that your fellow participants are here to learn something, and that this should be a space for all of us to respect the various points of view that we're going to hear, and create a space that is suited for learning. We will be taking questions at the end. So if you have questions, please use the Q&A feature to ask, and you can put those in throughout the conversation. You don't have to wait until the end, but just make sure that if you have a question for the panelists that you want the panelists to address, you're using the Q&A function and not the chat function. I also want to call out for our tech workers who are watching. If you work in tech and you are on board with what we're trying to do, we really ask that you join TechEquity as a member. We need your voice at the table to advance these conversations. And we'd really like to be able to do our work knowing that it's supported by the people who work in tech, and not have to rely so much on corporate or institutional money. So please join. It's $10 a month or $100 a year. And then speaking of joining, we're new to Instagram, and I think our content is really great, if I do say so myself. So if you can give us a follow on Instagram, Herman is posting the link in our username in the chat. That's one of the ways in which we disseminate easy to consume content, so you can learn more about the issues that we care about. So with that, we're going to get started with a really great set of panelists, and I'll introduce them as they go. We're going to start with Carolina Reed, who's a faculty research advisor for the Turner Center for Housing Innovation, which is an organization that we work closely with and is really doing the best research on the housing crisis in California, at least, that we have seen. And when I say the best, I mean research, and this is rarer than it should be, research that we really can use as advocates to advocate and push for smart data-driven policy. And they're out with a new report on Black homeownership and the wealth divide. And I'm going to turn it over to Carolina, who is going to share her screen and present on their findings before we get into a larger conversation with the rest of the panelists. So Carolina, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you for that very kind introduction. I am going to share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see it, and I'm going to get started. In these opening remarks, I'm going to try and provide just a little bit of context. Are you? Is it,
Slides are not
not showing.
Well, they're showing, but it's getting cut off there. So there.
Is that better?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, sorry about that. I'll start over. My goal for today in these opening remarks is to just provide some context for the ways in which our housing and financial markets continue to produce unequal outcomes, specifically for Black households. And as Catherine said, this presentation is based on a recent paper we published at the Turner Center called Crisis Response and Recovery, and it includes an appendix that has data on the Black-white homeownership gap, as well as some of the statistics I'm going to be showing today for large local metros. To start, I just want to acknowledge that the roots of racial inequality in land ownership go all the way back to slavery, right, and have been baked into the system since the country's founding. Just to give you one example, the 1862 Homestead Act, which stripped Indigenous tribes of their land and granted it to white settlers, continues to resonate today. Researchers estimate that up to 93 million Americans today, 99.7% of whom are white, are direct beneficiaries of the wealth and land transfer generated by that program alone. But it was the modern housing finance system, including the extensive federal role in facilitating homeownership after World War II, that really further entrenched racial disparities in housing. Throughout the 1940s and well into the 1960s, the federal government sanctioned and encouraged the systematic denial of credit to Black households through the practice of redlining. In this, government appraisers assess the risk and value of neighborhoods based partly on who lived there. Neighborhoods were designated as low risk and colored green if appraisers didn't see, and I quote, a single foreigner or Negro. In contrast, neighborhoods that displayed, and I'm going to quote again from the appraiser's handbook, the infiltration of inharmonious racial groups, were deemed hazardous and colored red, signaling that the government would not insure mortgages made in these communities. These maps didn't create the racial housing divide. They were a reflection of already existing and pervasive racism in society, but their significance endures in that they, as Rothstein has powerfully argued, put the federal government on record as explicitly linking the presence of Black people to lower quality housing in neighborhoods, which in turn shapes subsequent patterns of investment. Today, redline neighborhoods remain characterized by lower homeownership rates, as you can see here, higher rates of poverty, lower rates of economic mobility for children, reduced housing supply, and higher incidence of chronic diseases. And a recent study also shows the links between these historical practices and the COVID-19 pandemic. These enduring differences and effects are stark. Despite the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the fair housing laws that prohibit overt discrimination, we haven't effectively turned the page on these racist logics. And today, the Black-white homeownership gap is wider than it was in 1960, before the Fair Housing Act was passed. A number of factors contribute to this enduring racial divide, which I've tried to summarize visually on the left. These factors are interrelated, operate across all dimensions of the housing market and home buying process, and are of course tied to inequalities in other sectors as well, such as educational and labor market access. While I don't have time to go into each of these factors in detail, I do want to highlight a few areas that I believe need to be the focus of policy and innovation. The first driver of the racial housing divide is exclusionary zoning and the continued ways in which racial segregation is maintained through zoning and other discriminatory practices. Racial covenants, which prohibited non-whites from buying homes in restricted neighborhoods, have long been outlawed. But cities continue to pass zoning laws that restrict access, for example, through minimum lot sizes and limits on multifamily or apartment buildings. In addition, real estate agents continue to steer Black homebuyers to different neighborhoods. As a result, the vast majority, around 90%, of neighborhoods in major cities in the US rarely see loans made to Black homebuyers. In these neighborhoods, less than 5% of all loans go to Black homeowners, even though Blacks comprise approximately 13% of the US population. Researchers also estimate that Black and Hispanic families effectively need higher incomes than white families, around $8,000 more at the median, to access the same higher resource neighborhoods. The second driver of the housing divide is access to credit and the ways in which housing and financial markets measure, allocate, and price risk. There are a lot of dimensions to this problem, including access to intergenerational wealth, lower incomes, and lower credit scores among Black households. I think Alex is going to share how Landed is trying to help overcome these barriers during his remarks. But the combination of limited resources and lower credit scores has two important effects. First, Blacks are much more likely to be denied a mortgage at more than twice the rate of white homebuyers. Second, if they are offered a loan, they will pay a higher interest rate, even after controlling for observable characteristics. Researchers estimate that the average interest rate for Black homeowners is 33 basis points higher than for non-Hispanic whites, leading to long-term disparities in the cost of the loan, as well as how much wealth they can build. The third driver of the racial housing divide relates to the inequalities in the benefits that homeownership confers. Recent news stories have highlighted the role that unequal appraisals play in determining house values, with researchers at Brookings estimating that homes in Black neighborhoods are undervalued by an average of $48,000. The tax costs and benefits of homeownership are also unequally distributed. Studies have estimated that in predominantly Black neighborhoods, homeowners face an effective property tax that is 50% higher than homeowners in nearby white neighborhoods. As scholars have argued, this unequal system, grounded in racial segregation and operating through discriminatory housing and financial markets, allows for the continued extraction of wealth in Black communities. Nowhere is this more evident than in the repercussions of the foreclosure crisis, which had a disproportionate impact on Black and Hispanic homeowners. A dual mortgage market created by the lack of access to fair, responsible credit led to a proliferation of subprime lenders and predatory lending products in Black communities, followed by concentrated foreclosures. The federal government failed to step in quickly or boldly, and as a result, investors, as well as higher net worth households, were able to purchase assets in Black neighborhoods, benefiting from the subsequent house price appreciation during the recovery and changing the landscape of many formerly Black homeowning communities. This uneven recovery from the foreclosure crisis holds important lessons for the current moment, in which the economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic are falling hardest on communities of color. More than 2 times as many Black as white homeowners report being behind on their mortgage payments. Without explicit actions to support struggling homeowners, there's the risk that we will see another wave of foreclosures and real estate speculation that will further widen the racial housing divide. I know that was all pretty sobering and depressing. The important thing to remember is that we do actually have solutions, and that closing the racial housing divide is just going to take innovation in both the public and private sector, and a true commitment to investing in closing the racial homeownership gap. Certainly, a top priority needs to be to respond to the health and economic crisis created by COVID-19. But I hope that the current political moment also drives us to thinking more boldly about how to tackle the root causes of racial segregation, close disparities in access to credit and ownership, and invest in funding, subsidized and responsible loan products, and an enforced and enhanced enforcement of fair lending laws to help close this racial housing divide. Thank you so much. With that, Catherine, I'm going to turn it back to you.
That's great, Carolina, and you are right. It is very sobering. I think I'm hopeful that we can get to a place at the end of this where we are really thinking about a real path forward on closing the gap. And I want to introduce Nikitra Bailey now, who is sorry, let me pull up your full title here so I make sure I get it right. Executive Vice President for the Center for Responsible Lending. I mean, you live with these statistics every day and these facts every day. I'm wondering, what is your take on the, the findings from the Turner Center report? Where do you see the biggest barriers to closing the Black-white wealth gap? And when I say, I mean, some people may think we're conflating the wealth gap with the inequality in homeownership, but really the wealth gap is driven by homeownership to a very large extent. So it is correct for us to conflate the two things. What do you see are the biggest barriers to closing the gap? And is there any reason to be hopeful?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this opportunity to be here. I'm excited to be amongst friends and to be in a position to make new friends. And I'm not biased about Carolina's research because she's a former CRLer. So I want to put that out at the beginning. So the Center for Responsible Lending is a research and a policy advocacy organization. We're affiliated with one of the nation's largest community development financial institutions, Self-Help. And Self-Help has for more than 40 years provided access to credit in underserved communities across the nation. So Carolina hits really important points. And the first one is that structural racism and housing is something that has to be addressed. We know that because of structural racism and housing, that the families that are struggling with today's COVID-19 crisis are in a much worse position than they would have been otherwise. So that's the first thing that we know.
Yeah,
we also
sorry to interrupt.
know,
Nikitra, did I see a stat that Black homeowners are double or twice as likely to be facing foreclosure right now as white homeowners?
Yes, and unfortunately, it's the tale of a story that we've already been a part of, the story about the subprime lending crisis. So yes, today we see that disproportionately Black and Latino families are actually facing higher levels of foreclosure as a result of being hardest hit by COVID-19. This crisis has landed hardest on these communities that were already suffering from an economic standpoint. And I just want to walk us back through a few of the points that Carolina talked about, because it's something that we don't take into consideration when we're talking about housing and homeownership. These practices actually did start in slavery. Most people haven't read Matthew Desmond's piece as part of Hannah Jones's 1619 piece about kind of 1619 and what's going on in our economy. And he has a great piece that talks about how the first mortgages in our country were actually based on the bodies of enslaved African people. Our bodies at that time were actually more valuable than land. So when you got to the Homestead Act, we actually were left out of that act. And in fact, 20% of the families today who received Homestead Act grants then can trace their wealth back to that single policy. And when we look at the New Deal policies and get into how they've been implemented in such a way that they've advantaged white families and have disproportionately harmed African American and Latino families and other families of color, we know that only 2% of those mortgages in the first 35 years of the program actually went to families of color. So white families disproportionately received an ability to really build long-term wealth because they had an earlier entry point into homeownership. And we have to talk about the kind of homeownership that they had access to. They had access to lower cost mortgages that were subsidized by the federal government. And in many of the communities, builders themselves were using those subsidies, but they were denying Black people the ability to actually purchase a home in those communities. So what we've done is we've really held the hands of Black and Latino communities and have really pushed them to the side in an effort to really build up the American middle class, and we've left them behind. So this crisis falls disproportionately on them because leading into the subprime crisis of 2008, we saw Black and Latino families disproportionately pushed into those toxic mortgages. They actually had about 50% and 40% respectively of those subprime mortgage loans, despite many of them qualifying for credit on more affordable terms, and that was less risky. So our communities in 2008, that whole foreclosure period, we actually lost $1 trillion of wealth. That was long before COVID-19 started. And the recovery from that was such that lenders responded by tightening credit standards. And when they did that, what they did is they locked out borrowers who actually had a history of success in homeownership. So since then, if following the foreclosure crisis of 2008, if we had seen those pre-foreclosure crisis levels of homeownership in Black communities, we actually had 770,000 additional Black homeowners. And that's a fact that we don't often talk about and really dissect. So by the time we got to COVID-19, our communities were in a weaker financial position. And unfortunately, because of the history of discrimination and broader discrimination outside of just housing itself, we were in a situation where we're working in the service sector overwhelmingly. That's the sector that mostly was impacted by COVID because of the public charges to keep everyone safe. And disproportionately, Black and Latino families were not in a position where they could work from home. So we actually have seen impacts of COVID-19 on our lives, right? Even before we get to housing and homeownership, we've actually been impacted with higher levels of loss of life. And as this recovery is happening, we're not sharing in it equally. What we're seeing right now in the housing sector is that we are in a position where to get a mortgage right now, we're looking at credit scores that are about 742 average, which is about 45 points higher than they were when we went into the foreclosure crisis. And if you're even getting a loan refinance, which many families are doing to lower their monthly costs to offset losses of wages as a result of COVID-19, those families have scores on average at about 780. Because of that history of discrimination, Black and Latino families have actual lower credit scores because credit scoring itself bakes in the history of wealth. So, Dr. Sandy Darity at Duke University says that wealth begets wealth. So we're at a situation where when we look at credit scoring and other underwriting factors like down payments, we see African Americans and Latinos having less of an ability to save for those and delaying their entry into homeownership. So when we look at research that the Center for Responsible Lending has just done, we know that Black and Latino families are taking at least 14 years and 9 years respectively to actually save enough for a 5% down payment to actually enter into homeownership. So to wrap this all up, we need to see stronger enforcement of our fair lending laws. We've had fair lending laws on the books in this country since 1866. The first federal fair lending law was passed in Reconstruction. and it prohibited discrimination in housing. Unfortunately, it only had a private right of action. So the 68 Act is so fundamental in the sense that it banned discrimination, but it also put a responsibility on the federal government to actually affirmatively further fair housing, which means to intentionally create inclusive communities to undo the harm that it's previously done. And that's what we need to do today. We need to fully enforce the laws that we actually have already so that we can open up opportunity for more Americans and really grow the economy. This isn't something that's just nice to do for Black people and for Latino people. It will actually grow the economy by at least $1 trillion a year, because research has shown that discrimination targeted at Black Americans alone has cost our economy $16 trillion, including in housing. We'd create thousands of jobs and we generate billions of dollars in local revenues.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important for everybody to be very clear that if you care about racial equity and wealth inequality, this has to be your #1 issue, right? Like we will not get to full racial and economic equity without solving discrimination and bias in the housing system. And I want to come back to how we actually do that. But first, I want to get Alex's voice in this conversation. I feel like we kind of are going on a trajectory through time. It's starting through history and coming through the present and COVID crisis. And now Alex is going to be our representative from the future.
I've always wanted to be able to time travel. So this is my opportunity. I'm going to share my screen now. Firstly, hard access.
While you're doing that, let me introduce you real quick.
Yeah, sure.
You are the co-founder of Landed, which you're going to tell us in a second what Landed is. But I'm also hoping you can talk to us about how what sort of innovative and maybe tech-enabled solutions, like what you're building at Landed, can be part of the solution to the problem of the wealth divide. So
awesome. Yeah. Thank you, Catherine. And I'm definitely here to represent just one example of innovation that I think we're trying collectively. The reality, there's no silver bullet. There's no one solution to any of this. So I want to set the record straight and be clear. I'm not trying to claim that all problems are solved here. I'm trying to share that there's some innovation within this system that we're trying to do and working on and seeing some results in that we think are promising. But hopefully it's just a platform for us to have this conversation more about other innovations that can occur. So Landed, one of the co-founders of Landed, and we're generally on a mission to help build wealth for those who are in the kind of low, modest, middle income bracket and build financial security. And we're primarily focused on what we call essential professionals. We've been calling that for several years, but essentially think about your teacher, your firefighter, someone who works at a school district or local government. And what you should know about the mission of the we're on at Landed is pretty personal to me. On the left-hand side, I always like to start sharing that my mom was a 4th grade school teacher. My dad was a social worker. I won the lottery on love and support. So like, I got to just start there, but money was always tight. And it wasn't until my grandmother passed away and passed along her home to us did we get to experience, and that was the first example of intergenerational wealth being transferred to my family. Did we get to experience the power of homeownership? It was the tool that allowed my parents to send me to college that I went to. There we are on my graduation day, too many years ago. It allowed my parents to be a bedrock financially for our extended family. It allowed them to retire ultimately. So just, what I took away from that lived experience was, dang, I can't believe it takes the luck and fortune of intergenerational wealth to get started in buying a home, because there's no way they would have been able to do that, have that financial tool. What would it look like to be able to scale something that helped people get over one of the biggest barriers to homeownership, which is having capital to start off the pathway towards homeownership. And just real quick, so you know what we do at Landed. We do a number of things. We have financial solutions. We help people connect to brokers who are real estate agents who are helping to buy a home. We help with resources and guidance, but we're known for a down payment program, a shared equity down payment program. And the idea here was, how do we take lessons from institutions like big institutions like Stanford University or the city of San Francisco and apply and kind of scale this idea that you can provide upfront capital to help with a down payment so you can get into it. And if you can afford to rent, you can afford a mortgage on a month-to-month basis. So if you're in that position, you can get that upfront capital and get into homeownership. You can take the advantage of the benefits of that. And we ultimately provide, we co-invest in homes through an options contract. And so if the value of the home goes up, we'll share in part of the appreciation of the home. If the value of the home goes down, we'll share in part of the loss of the home, proportional to how much down payment support you get in the front end. And we have home buyers of all sorts on the right-hand, on the right-hand side of the screen here. We have home buyers who range in age. We have couples, we have singles. So we try to be as open, as wide as possible to the number of people that can participate in our program, and have a team that helps us, a big team that helps us do that. I don't want to go too much into this in depth because we just covered it, and I think it's really important, but it's worth repeating that long-term home ownership ultimately is a key to building wealth, that you can't solve this problem of wealth if you don't look at home ownership in our current economy. Renters don't capture wealth as a result of due to price appreciation in their home. Renters don't benefit from the gains that you get in having a sense of forced savings by paying down a mortgage. And owning a home has a lot of other benefits to civic participation and other really important components. Lack of down payment savings, that's the number one significant barrier to home ownership for many people, especially the essential professionals we're working with. We're looking at the average down payment being 4 to 10 times, or the housing prices being 4 to 10 times the median household income, and it taking 14 to 17 years to save for a 20% down payment. We focus on 20% because there's a lot of reasons. There's a lot of reasons for that. If you're familiar with housing, you'll know 20% is a really magical number. It helps reduce the cost of home ownership on a regular basis, on a monthly basis, and makes you much more competitive as a buyer. We covered this. Wealth disparities are growing. They have grown more and more by race in the last several years. And one of the interesting other components here is just looking at statistics and research done on intergenerational wealth. The reality is that white families have more money to pass along up to their children and to others to get started than Black and brown families. Ultimately, if you look at solutions like shared equity and scaling shared equity, you see there's a potential for some of the solution being here. That ultimately about 15.2, this is a study by Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies, about 15.2 million households can make the monthly mortgage payments, but would need down payment assistance of somewhere between $25,000 to $100,000 or over $100,000. 6.6 are in that kind of $25,000 to $100,000 range. And the majority of people who would benefit from this are brown and Black folks, because guess what? Don't have intergenerational wealth, don't have the bank of mom and dad to get started. So what we do at Landed, we're trying to scale shared equity. It takes a lot of capital to do that. To hand over $25,000 or $100,000 per household for down payment support, it's a lot of money. And governments and nonprofits can't do it alone. The programs that exist haven't scaled. So we're trying to leverage the private capital system, the private markets, the capital markets to bring the money that's needed to the table to actually scale a program like this. And so for customers, we're focused on the lack of intergenerational wealth, and for investors, giving exposure to owner-occupied real estate and making that marriage actually work. I won't go into our business model here too much. Just know that the sustainability part of our business, we actually generate revenue from real estate agents that help keep our lights on, and then we get money from impact capital, pension funds, et cetera, to provide capital for the shared equity program. And then I'll just leave you with the, who are the, this is not just some idea. We've been doing this for several years, and there are people all across the country that have access to homeownership as a result of doing this work. We've found that on average, about 88% of folks are first-time home buyers, 45% are low to modest income, and 74% are low to middle income households. And the majority of our home buyers are minority households. Now, I want to point out limitations to our program and why it's not a silver bullet. About 7.7% are Black families. We've heard the statistics that's lower than the average in our country. And so there's some reasons for this. One part of it's like just the size of our company and where we've launched and where we've been able to expand to, which is certain metros that have certain demographics. But otherwise, even with down payment support, Black families just don't have a lot of wealth. And so we ask families to come to the table with at least 5%. A lot of folks can't even get to 5%. So it limits how many people can actually use their program. And ultimately, we don't solve for the competitiveness of markets. They're really expensive. They're getting more expensive. We all have heard the news about pension institutions buying up more and more homes and turning them into rentals. That makes prices go up even more. So there's limitations to any one solution. That's why you need partners. That's why we need a toolkit to figure this out. This is just one of those tools. So call to action here is the need has never been greater, especially for our Black and Brown families, and competition is high. And would love I'm really looking forward to our conversation now.
Alex, that was great. And I think I'm going to ask that you share the slides so that we can share those out, because there's a lot of really great information in there that I'm sure people will want to dig into. I want to come back to that question about corporate ownership. I know that's not a question I gave to you all in prep for this, but I'm just like previewing it now, and I hope that y'all can weigh in on that. But going back, Nikitra, to what you were talking about, it does seem like we're in this moment in the country where there's political will to tackle explicitly racial equity issues. And the Biden administration has been very bold about what they're saying they will do around housing in particular to close the racial equity gaps there. I'm wondering if you can just talk about how you see, I guess this is for you, and then also Carolina, how you see that proposal set. Is it enough? If not, what else should the federal government be looking at doing?
Absolutely, and thank you. We think it's long past time for there to be a race justice focus in homeownership. We're not going to get out of these problems if we actually don't look at the reality that race has been a critical part of how these problems have been built in. And they've been built in such a systematic way that we have to explicitly, boldly come up with solutions for racial injustice in housing. And one of the things that we believe will work is a targeted down payment assistance plan. We've been calling for targeting funds to first generation home buyers. And we've been calling for, at a minimum, $20,000 as part of a down payment plan. We've run research and looked at numbers based on some calculations done by the Urban Institute. If you create such a program, and we've done this in coalition with the National Fair Housing Alliance, if you look at the numbers, we have the potential to create 5 million new home buyers if we actually invest about $100 billion in getting it done. Out of those 5 million new home buyers, 1.7 million of them will be Black Americans. We know that people lack intergenerational wealth because of the history of discrimination. They don't have, as been already said by Alex, the bank of their parents or others to tap into. There just isn't this opportunity. And then the other thing that's really disproportionately impacting people's ability to create down payments is student loan debt. I think I saw the question in the chat, quite frankly. Black and Latino students disproportionately have to borrow more to fund their higher education. And Black students in particular actually leave college and their debt actually grows. So 20 years out, we have Black students owing more on their student loans than they actually did when they graduated because of broader societal discrimination where people are not receiving pay equity. So it's critical that we have race-specific strategies that get us at underserved communities, and we do everything that we can to really bring them in a very bold and unapologetic way.
Carolina, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree with everything that Nikitra said. And I think it also needs to be coupled with these fair enforcement of fair housing laws and affirmatively furthering fair housing. I think one of the things that we have learned is if you are extending credit and extending home ownership in a society that is racially segregated, right, that opens up these opportunities for speculation and extraction. And so tackling this racial segregation piece is also key. And that's going to also require a supply response, right? It also means building more affordable housing in more communities, and quite frankly, taking away the power of some of these exclusionary cities to limit who is able to move into into those regions. And so, one, we have to invest in expanding access to homeownership, and two, we need to do that within a framework that is furthering fair housing. I would just like to add one other thing. I also think it's really important that we don't forget the community development piece of this and investing in Black neighborhoods and making sure that those are also highly resourced, rich places to live. Because again, this sort of creates this unequal landscape. And so there's a lot of interesting models emerging to invest in communities in responsible ways, and particularly in the Bay Area where we're concerned about displacement and gentrification, thinking about how to help more families stay in those neighborhoods is also important.
And if I could just add one other thing, lenders could actually do something. They don't have to wait for Congress or for regulators, right? The Equal Credit Opportunity Act already allows lenders to create what's called special purpose credit programs. These are programs that they can create for underserved communities that they actually underserve. And the CFPB has already, which is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, has already provided guidance that special purpose credit programs are fully legal under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and Regulation B. So lenders could actually jumpstart these programs. We heard following last summer's, social unrest, all of these bold promises about billions of dollars being poured into our communities. Well, here's this tool that you could use to really design a solution to reach people and really bring them into homeownership, because it's so important.
Yeah, and so just a note on exclusionary zoning, and also on this next question that I'm going to get to, which connects, Nikitra, around algorithmic bias. We did an event last Thursday actually on exclusionary zoning. So if folks want to learn more about that, you can watch that webinar. I'll ask Herman or Marion to drop a link to that in the chat. And then a couple of months ago, we had a conversation on algorithmic bias in housing with Lisa Rice from National Fair Housing Alliance, you referenced. So if folks are interested in digging in more on that topic in particular, we'll post a link. Also, I see folks who are raising their hand and also potentially putting questions in the chat. If you have a question for the panelists, please use the Q&A function, and we'll get to those in just a minute. Actually, this is going to be my last question before we go to the audience, is on algorithmic bias. And I think, Nikitra, you mentioned that lending agencies could do more, and there are actually more tools. If you tune into that webinar we did, we talked about some of them. Technology can be used to create more equity and to reduce some of the bias in lending models, right? Where a lot of this bad data is baked in, and now machine learning lets us refine. It also might perpetuate bias in some ways that we don't understand. Can you talk about, this is kind of open to all three of you, but I'll start with you, Nikitra, the ways that you see new technologies, algorithms and machine learning actually either solving or potentially worsening the problem?
I think you're absolutely right. Technology can actually, democratize credit, which could really change things. Unfortunately, we know that a lot of things are being programmed with existing bias. So what we need to see is affirmative steps to really de-bias existing technology, to really take the bias out, to actually do that on the front end, because so much harm is done. And then we also need to make this link to what's happening in this conversation around climate. Oftentimes we're not thinking about what's happening there. Because of this history of redlining, communities of color are already suffering from toxic environmental racism. And technology is already building kind of systems to determine future catastrophe and future risks. Well, technology should start looking right at the previous risks and the assessments that we've already created based on that history of redlining, where families of color are disproportionately pushed into more toxic areas already. And if we're going to create new assessments to determine what should impact how we determine climate risk, then why don't you build climate infrastructure right now with a fair housing lens, to build those fair lending assessments as part of your processes right now, so that we're not catching up? Because unfortunately, I think Carolina will get into this, we are playing catch up and kind of underwriting criteria already.
Yeah, Alex or Carolina, are there things that you're seeing in the sort of machine learning or technical innovation space that you think are things we should look out for, either as solutions or potential harms?
Alex, go ahead.
Well, I actually, ironically, I think I just have a perspective that has less to do with the technology, more the people behind the technology who design, which is that, I mean, ultimately what needs to change, for those who don't consider themselves very technical, I think what's helpful to think about is just that when we say technology can solve, ultimately, oftentimes it's just a second step. It's an algorithm, a computer that will be very, very efficient, 100% efficient. And then a second step that slows down that efficiency one notch to check for outcomes that are not favorable, right? And introducing that second step is just super key, right? But you have to have buy-in. What'd you say?
You have to know what to look for.
You have to know what to look for. So as a result, that's a people question, right? The people have to figure that out. So I think it's a pretty simple, but like not easy to do, is building more community of practice of learning amongst the engineers, the product decision makers, to understand these core pieces, our history and where we're at, and then sharing ideas on how to solve that so that they can be scaled faster. And we have on our team an incredible engineering team. They're the ones who push the question for us all the time. Hey, in our partnerships with appraisers and our partnerships with real estate agents, et cetera, how are we thinking about mitigating bias, right? We want to build a community of folks like our engineers on our team. And so those of you who are on this call who find yourself as one of those people, my charge to you is, build that community and help us build a community. Work with TechEquity.
Your charge is for them to join TechEquity.
Join TechEquity to do that. That's what I was going to get to. But no, I really believe that's kind of I think that's the key, because I think a lot of people are starting to have awareness of this and kind of want to do something, and it's in your power. You're just going to need to coordinate with each other to learn more quickly.
Yeah, and that's actually, we're in the process of writing a piece with the National Fair Housing Alliance, who have also identified that, the biggest lever of change is creating understanding in the companies that are making these decisions. And so we really, obviously, we believe that. That's why we host events like this. It's why TechEquity exists. So thank you for giving us the best advertisement you could have given.
I mean, 100%.
And there's an economic imperative to do so. This is the thing that we don't talk about. The future of the mortgage market is Black and brown. 7 out of 10 future home buyers are going to be people of color. So if we don't figure out how to create a healthy system, we might not have a mortgage market, period. So that's something for us to take into consideration with technology as well.
I'll also share one other building.
Wait. No, you can't share. I'm sorry.
Dang.
We have to let our participants in the chat.
That's right,
There's
that's right. Okay,
a lot of questions, so I'm going to invite Marion back to let us know what's been going on down there.
Yeah. There's been a lot going on. And thank you all so much for this amazing conversation. It's been so rich. And I feel like I've learned a lot in this last hour. We have a lot of questions from participants. So thank you everyone who submitted one. I'm going to try to get to as many as possible. First, we have a question about effective property tax. Why and how is effective property tax rate higher for families of color?
Carolina, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, and so the mechanisms by which that occurs varies by metropolitan area, just because taxes are set locally. But you can think about it just in the context of California and Prop 13, and the fact that Prop 13 rewards homeowners who have lived in their homes longer and for more stable time periods. And they are going to be paying a lower property tax on houses that are valued more. Whereas in Black community, you may see greater sort of sales and turnovers of homes. You may see people buying homes more recently. And so that's one of the dynamics that can contribute to that. I'm happy to put the link to the study in the chat if you want to learn more.
Great. Marianne, back to you.
Yeah, and we actually have some prospecting homeowners in the attendance who are trying to buy a home, and they found that there's not a lot of help for people of color, and for Black people in particular. So some folks are wondering how they, as hopeful homeowners, can get help now, if there are resources that any of you know of.
Nikita?
One of the things I encourage people to do is to really work with a HUD certified housing counselor. They are there with duties to help you make the best financial decisions for you, not just anyone. It needs to be a HUD certified housing counselor. And they know about products related to shared equity that are driven by nonprofits that are safe, where they're going to make sure the community interest is held and focused, and they can connect you with those resources.
I'm pulling up the link and I'll drop it in the chat to HUD's housing counselors.
And I'm just going to back up what Nikita just said, because that's one of the things that we also found as a private sector actor, that like one of the best things to do and most important things to do is to partner with the infrastructure that already exists. Because the reality is that we actually do have, as a country, have a lot of infrastructure here. One of the biggest challenges, it's very, we are decentralized democracy, right? We're decentralized. So one of the biggest challenges is connecting the dots or finding that information. So one of our goals has been to connect people we work with to the right, either to HUD counseling specifically, or to a better partner if there's a better opportunity for them. Because sometimes there can be, there can be a better option for you, but it's just finding out about it. And those HUD certified counselors are a fantastic way to navigate that.
And I know there are national urban league branches across the state of California, so Sacramento, LA, and in other communities. They also are HUD certified housing counselors. So just in terms of giving you a name of the kind of places that you should be looking for.
Great. Marianne, back to you.
Awesome. We had a couple of questions about ways to have wealth building opportunities outside of the speculative market. Some people brought up co-op housing, community land trusts. So what are some ideas broadly for long-term transformational solutions, including any of the above?
And if I can piggyback onto that question relatedly, we didn't get to this earlier, but this whole idea of corporate ownership of homes and how that has changed the dynamic of like what the possibilities around home ownership are for individuals and families. So Carolina, maybe we'll start on that.
Yeah, so this is partly what I meant by my comment around really needing to focus on community development and community-driven investments. Part of the problem after the foreclosure crisis was that mission-driven institutions and, to Nikita's point, home buyers who had been foreclosed upon couldn't access properties that were coming on the market. And so to the extent that COVID leads to foreclosures, we need to make sure that mission-driven entities, and by that I mean CDFIs or community development organizations, are able to purchase those homes and put them in long-term affordable situations. And that could be sort of an affordable rental over the long term. It could be a community land trust, which preserves affordability over the long term. It could be a cooperative structure. The problem is that the federal government has never really invested in both funding and sustaining those models. And I think doing that would lead to a lot more sort of Black-led community development and a lot more sustainable communities over time.
Alex, are you seeing other models? I mean, Landed is in some ways an answer to that question. What else is out there?
I think that the topic of collective ownership as opposed to individual ownership is really key. I think diversity of options is better for an economy. The word is diversification. Anytime you want to build wealth, you want to diversify your money, right? In case something goes up here, it goes down here. So just thinking the same thing, but on the topic of ways in which you can buy. I would love to call attention to an organization called Obran, OBRAN.org. Really, it's an interesting model focused first and foremost on worker-owned business, but it's a very similar idea and can be transferred over. And actually, they're doing some work on ownership of land as well. That it's a lot of it's about having the scale, trying to figure out ways to have scales, benefits of scale, but still very locally owned assets. So kind of figuring out what's the infrastructure that needs to happen so that local ownership can be scaled, basically. So I think that's one of the most interesting pieces. But I generally, what I always say is Landed is trying to work on the here and now. What is the way their economy is right now, and which is oriented towards private ownership and getting people that acts like democratizing access, because otherwise it's just going to look a certain way if we don't have more people getting access. Yet it's not the sole solution. I mean, if you can change the dynamics of the economy where collective is another option, then I think you'll see a healthier economy over time.
Great. I think, Marion, we have time for one more.
Sounds good. We've talked a lot in this discussion about how there actually are a lot of policies in place, laws have been passed for decades, and a lot of infrastructure existent in our country to help people get onto the path of homeownership. And so someone in the Q&A has asked, what can I do as a citizen, as a voter, and as a neighbor to support these laws and policies being implemented in their communities?
A lot of local jurisdictions actually have fair lending protection. So you can write your local mayor or your city council, and you can tell them that those laws are important and you want to see them fully enforced. You can write to your members of Congress, and you can ask them to ask the federal banking regulators what's being done to ensure that the nation's Fair Housing Act, the nation's Equal Credit Opportunity Act, and the nation's Community Reinvestment Act are being fully enforced to really open up opportunity for underserved communities to get access to the credit that they actually deserve.
Yeah, and I'll add, I mean, just as a way to kind of transition into the close here, we've talked a lot about federal policy, and the federal government has a lot of influence over especially homeownership and making it possible for more people to be homeowners. But housing policy is by definition very local. And if you are not engaged in these conversations in your neighborhoods, in your city councils, in those very local areas, it's going to be a lot harder to get to change. And I know it's not sexy, but the people who show up and influence housing policy at the local level are people who have a vested interest in the status quo. And we need more voices from people who want to make change to show up in those conversations as well. So go to meetings, support elected officials who support a housing equity agenda, oppose those who are NIMBYs and don't want to fix the status quo. And if you will work in tech, TechEquity is a place for you to sort of aggregate your voice along with other disproportionately powerful civic actors. Tech workers have a lot of power that they aren't using to really advance an agenda that we think will help us bring us closer to equity. We do that very strategically, and we do it in partnership with a lot of the organizations who are working closest to the ground. So that is just one more plug for you if you work in the tech sector to become involved in our work. I think we're going to wrap it up there. I want to thank Nikitra, Carolina, and Alex so much. This was a really engaging conversation, and I'm so sorry to those of you who were not able to get your question answered, but we will be sending a follow-up email that will include slides from the presenters, a link to the report that the Turner Center just put out, and some of the other resources that we mentioned. And please just continue to plug into TechEquity resources so you can deepen your knowledge about this really important topic. We're not going to stop fighting for housing justice and racial equity in housing ever until it's solved. So we hope you'll join us in that journey. Thank you all so much, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.